I would like to start with the question about Maidan. So Amnesty has recently issued a statement criticizing the investigation of Maidan shootings, and you said that it's a disgrace for Ukrainian justice. Can you tell us more about that, please?
Indeed, I'm here in Kyiv at a very important time, the 5th anniversary of the brutal crackdown on the protests in Maidan Square, and that moment in Ukrainian history was a travesty. It was a tragedy to see protesters gunned down, killed with such brutality and force. And 1 year later, Amnesty International issued a report called Justice Delayed, Justice Denied. And at that point, we were already flagging, highlighting the fact that the authorities were far too slow in terms of investigations, in terms of finding the truth, justice. And here we are now, 4 years later again, and we're still raising the same question: justice denied, justice delayed. It's unacceptable that the authorities are not demonstrating the political will, not providing the resources, not providing the authority to the investigators to proceed swiftly and quickly to fully investigate the killings and the beatings, the attacks against innocent demonstrators during those days. And the international community, not just Amnesty International, are holding a spotlight on the Ukrainian authorities and saying this is a watershed issue. Ukraine has to address this black spot and ensure that truth comes out. Unfortunately, the fact that time is moving on is highly problematic for two reasons. Firstly, for the families, for those who suffered greatly at that time. Their suffering must be addressed. It's not going to go away. It's going to fester, it's going to get worse, it's going to become a bigger and bigger problem in terms of the justice agenda that we have to have in Ukraine. And unless those families get truth, recognition, reparations, the time factor will be irrelevant. Secondly, as time goes on, the issue of impunity becomes hugely problematic, because as the authorities are sweeping these abuses under the carpet, it creates a climate where violent groups feel that they're going to get away with the kind of hate crimes and attacks that we're seeing on the rise in the Ukraine. There's a direct connection between the failure to investigate the killings in Maidan and the climate, the culture that's allowing human rights violations to continue and to grow as violent groups are becoming more prolific.
If such organizations as Amnesty International give these red flags to the Ukrainian authorities that these cases have to be investigated, and they promised they would do it, what image does it make for them and for Ukraine in particular in the international arena?
Yeah. So this is a critical issue in terms of Ukraine's positioning internationally, mainly because, of course, the actual events themselves 5 years ago were directly linked to how Ukraine was shaping its future in terms of its position in the world, its position vis-à-vis Europe. So obviously the nations and peoples of Europe and the world have their eye still on this case and where Ukraine is positioning itself. It's hugely important that the authorities realise that governments of Europe, governments of the world, do still expect justice, do still expect truth. And if Ukraine does want to advance its relationships with other governments, with the EU, there has to be a serious and very rigorous investigation, and we have to find truth, we have to find justice for families.
Another issue here is that during Euromaidan, Ukrainians fought for the pro-European direction, pro-European values, and human rights is one of the core values for the European Union as well. We have a problem today of the rise of xenophobic movements. So people are not exactly ready to accept all the human rights values. Is it possible to come to Europe accepting only some of those values?
Well, firstly, human rights values, those values around justice, equality, fairness, are universal. They are inalienable. They belong to all people everywhere. And while governments from Russia to the United States and many places in between might not recognise that, the fact is that we have all rights for all people. And the government of Ukraine does need to recognise and accept that. The rise in xenophobia, the rise in hate crime, the rise in nationalism is a scourge on human rights. It creates a climate where people feel that civil liberties and human rights can be diminished, can be undermined, can be eroded. And unfortunately, we're seeing a trend across the world, and including in the EU, where governments now feel that human rights are for sale. Indeed, we're seeing a rise in demonic politics, a rise in populism, a rise in ethno-nationalism, which is based on fear. It's based on this doctrine of a nationalist identity being presented as a simplistic value set, as a simplistic solution to social questions and problems. However, with that, we're seeing a conservative shift away from civil liberties and away from human rights. We're selling out on these rights at great cost for future generations. So, to answer your question, Ukraine, the EU, the US, Russia, every country, every government has to commit to do more to protect civilians, to protect human rights, to protect the values on which we can build a fairer and a better society for all.
This year marks 70th anniversary for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Why 70 years passed? In 2019, we still have to discuss the issue, why should we protect the human rights? What are the human rights? Why is it still on the plate?
Well, firstly, power and corruption and the way in which power can be abused is omnipresent in society. It will always be there, and it will always be a challenge, and it will always be something we have to address. And that power is influenced and exercised in different ways over different generations. And what we're seeing currently is how despotic rulers, democratically elected presidents and heads of state and heads of government are using populism and using repression to push back on human rights in the name of power politics. That's what it's all about. And the key to unlocking that is really looking at the issues around discrimination, marginalisation and voicelessness. Part of the reason why you're having democratically elected presidents or prime ministers who are actually undermining society and still winning support is because people are feeling marginalised. They're feeling that the government's not listening to them. They're feeling that big institutions of state and the international system are not working for them, are not listening to them, are not providing solutions. They're searching for simplistic answers in simplistic policies where they will certainly fail to find what they want. And we're seeing governments exploit that. And the response has to come from civil society, from ordinary people who believe in fairness, believe in justice, believe in dignity, believe in what's right. And we have to ensure that states are hearing that message, that people want to be treated fairly, that people want the law to work for them, that they don't want this rise in inequality, that they don't want this rising discrimination that we're seeing sweeping across the world. The legal frameworks which have been built up under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the constitutional law frameworks which have been built up in post-Second World War Europe are hugely valuable. And those legal frames came at great cost. And now to see governments from Poland to the United States, from Philippines to Egypt, from Russia to Venezuela, eroding these rights so willingly is a tragedy.
It seems to me that such issues as human rights, they should be immune to the changing of political system or propaganda. So what went wrong here? Was there not enough things that could provide for the human rights to become universal, or there was not enough protection for human rights? What was the reason for these shifts in dialogue here?
Well, I think it's more a question of what went right, because the fact is that the human rights law, the human rights framework, the human rights protections and mechanisms which have been introduced have been working, and we are seeing a rise in democracy. We're seeing a rise overall in terms of societal responses to issues like conflict and war, and we're seeing generally a very positive trend globally in terms of standard of living. The way in which that's being manipulated by power brokers who are peddling fear of gay people, fear of people who are not like them, is something that's manufactured, right? And it's being manufactured in a kind of an us versus them argument to generate fear and to essentially silence the majority. Because if people are afraid, if people are focused on the other rather than focused on building society, power becomes diluted, and in that space autocracies and the kind of power of demonic politics can thrive.
We have a war in Ukraine right now, and this war is also used as a trigger of fear. We have problems with the LGBTI community in Ukraine because more and more people are attacked. We have problems with the internally displaced people because they are highly stigmatized by Ukrainian people. I mean, the ones who came from Crimea and Donbas area. What should Ukrainian authorities do to stop this downhill for the human rights in Ukraine in the time of conflict?
Well, of course, at a time of conflict, everything is obviously more complicated and more challenging. And of course, society is manipulated more in a context of war and division. And that's precisely the time when the state needs to focus most on law and legal standards. Human rights law, humanitarian law are there as a framework to ensure that society can thrive even in a context of conflict. Now, what's very important to recognise is that in Ukraine today, human rights violations are being perpetrated across the board by separatist groups, by Russian authorities in Russian-occupied Crimea, and in the Ukraine by violent groups by the state. We have to look at it as a problem that needs to be addressed across all areas of the country by all powers and authorities. And the more focus and energy that the authorities here in Ukraine put into the rule of law now, the sooner you will see a normal, peaceful society evolve again in the country.